Hello and welcome to the Geocurrents lecture series on global demography. This is the second to last lecture in this series. It's going to address a very important question, which is why fertility rates are declining. I'm interested in this globally, but this lecture will focus on the United States. And we'll make a few statements about other countries, but the main emphasis is on the U.S., which has seen uh, fertility rates well below replacement level since 2008 and fertility rates that are currently declining. Now, there's a widespread assumption in the United States, at least I've had many questions about this, the assumption being that Roman Catholics in the U.S. have a higher than average fertility rate. And this is no longer the case. It certainly was true, particularly during the baby boom. This is just information derived from ChatGPT. But you can see from the areas that I've highlighted that the peak of the baby boom, 1960, Catholic fertility was significantly higher than the national average. National average 3.7 children per woman. Catholic rate put here is 3.8, which is not significantly higher, but up to as high as 4.5. There are no good numbers on this. The U.S. Census Bureau didn't collect this sort of information, and there were few surveys at the time. But by 1980, as this table indicates, continuing decline in Roman Catholic fertility approaching the general population. And it's essentially no difference today between, or very little between Catholics and others. This is something that some Catholic scholars and theologians are worried about. It's an article from Crisis Magazine about the alarming fertility decline among American Catholic women. The chart associated with this shows the number of large families, 4 or more children, by religious category. And you can see in the 1970s, 37% of Catholics were in this category, dropping down to 17%. And the largest drop of any of these groups. And the author goes on to note the overwhelming majority of married Catholic women use artificial birth control, including what the author calls shockingly high levels of abortion and the use of the so-called morning after pill. I spent a lot of time looking for graphs or charts on different fertility rates among different faiths in the U.S. This is the best I found, and although the article is from 2021, the data has to be from before 2008, just by virtue of the fertility levels here. And so I don't know how much, I don't know how accurate this is, nor do I know how much it's changed. It does show Mormons as having the highest fertility rate in earlier periods, and that's probably still true, although it has declined significantly. They have Muslim fertility rate pretty similar to that of the Mormons. Orthodox, Protestant, Catholic, Christians all at about the same level. Jews somewhat less, and even smaller numbers for atheists, Buddhists, and Hindus. For groups like the Hindus, this is not so much a feature of Hinduism as it is the fact that most Hindus in the United States are relatively affluent, highly educated, urban in location, and all these other features that correlate with lower fertility. What does seem to be true, though, is a growing divergence between religious and non-religious people in terms of fertility. So here's a graph from Family Studies Institute, demographer Lyman Stone. I should say this is a pro-natalist institute in general, but it does very solid demographic research. I'm a little suspicious of this chart, though. I put a heavy red line for 2008. That was the financial crisis and also the year when fertility really started to plummet in the U.S. And it shows that the non-religious population in the blue line actually increased their fertility for the next couple of years. And I'm just a little suspicious of that. But what I do think holds is the growing divergence that you can see here more recently with these three lines, yellow being people who attend religious service weekly or more, red attend but less than weekly, and then blue the non-religious. So you can see for those who attend religious services weekly or more still have above replacement fertility as opposed to all of the other groups. Now this only goes to 2020, but the trends have continued. For example, here's a graph from another article, Religiosity and Fertility in the United States, and it looks at fertility intentions. And I've highlighted certain lines and colored them to make it clear. And the red ones are showing people for whom religion is very important, and blue, people for whom religion is not important at all. And on the bottom left, you can see people in this category when they're young had very different fertility intentions. So the for a number of children intended for the non-religious is about 2, replacement level essentially, whereas for the more religious, more like 2.6 or 7 or so. And then you can see actually that intention went down with age and then slightly up at the end. But maybe more important is the line showing mean number of children born, and what a difference you end up with those for whom religion was not important, less than 1.5, and for whom religion is important, well over 2. So if if religious people are having more children, many would say, well, that indicates a rosy future for religious faiths, which have been in decline. And you could see in the graph here how much they have been in decline. So the pink line shows the religiously unaffiliated from 2006 going up from 16% to some almost 27%. And then white evangelical Protestants, non-evangelical Protestants, and Catholics all declining proportionally or semi-proportionally. And that has been the general tendency from 2006 to till quite recently, 2020 or 2022. And Lyman Stone cautions those people who think that higher birth rates among the religious will help stave off the decline of religion. He says it's probably in vain because rates of conversion into irreligion are too high. So there's simply too many people who are raised in a religious context and environment then leave the faith. Now, it's not true in all categories. And one thing that's quite interesting, I think at any rate, is that among the most religious, so the religious sects that are most demanding and traditionalist, however you want to look at them, generally have high rates of retention and very high rates of fertility. So there's a couple of groups I'm going to look at in a little bit more detail. One would be the Old Order Amish, Anabaptist group like the Mennonites and Hutterites. These are all groups that believe in adult baptism and also maintaining quite separate from the society around them. The Amish to a very high degree. They don't speak English as their first language, but rather Low German dialects. And the total fertility of the Amish is estimated between 6 and 6.5 children per woman. That means that they are in exponential growth, doubling every 20 years from roughly 20 years, from 380 Amish in the U.S. In 2024, and that's up from 125,000 in 1990, and the population could reach 1 million by 2050. So it's easy to plot these growth rates into the future. This is taking it all the way up to 2,100 with 4.5 million Amish, which would be a very significant number. And I always want to caution these sort of exponential growth curves almost always, always going to end eventually for one reason or another. But the Amish do have low rates of defection. ChatGPT tells me that's 10 to 15%, and note this is remarkably high. An article on the Old Order Amish to leave or remain in the faith shows that their retention rate has actually increased. So this was a study from 1990s, but it looked at different cohorts of birth years. And people, Amish born between 20 and 29, 18% left, whereas those born 1960 to 1969, 5% have left. And it is, I think, very intriguing that religious faiths that make the most demands on their adherents tend to have higher retention levels, or at least in these more extreme examples. And the Amish are also interesting because they're young, particularly their young men are encouraged to take a short period of time after they come of age and temporarily leave the community and spend time with mainstream society or the English, is what the Amish, I believe, call them, to get a taste of that life and then decide whether they want to come back to the community. And the vast majority do. When they come back, then they're baptized, get married quickly, start having a family. And you see very similar things with the Haredi Jewish population. So estimates of total fertility between 4.5 and 6.5, but for the more traditionalist Hasidic groups, you can see, for example, the Satmar Lubavitch Hasidic Jews, 5.5 to 6.5. It's pretty similar to the Amish. They also have a similar defection rate, and it's estimating, again, population doubling every 20 years, and that by 2060, 25% of Jews in the United States are expected to be the Haredi Jews, who remain very distinctive, speak Yiddish as their first language, and remain at arm's distance from the culture and its technology, I should say. Haredi Jews in the United States are closely associated with Williamsburg in Brooklyn and New York City, which has been the center for some time. But the community has sort of outgrown this urban environment, and they're moving into the exurbs, the sort of suburban fringe of New York. Two counties in particular, one in New York and one in New Jersey, and you can just see from this graph how their total fertility rates in the counties as a whole have gone up to 3 or more children per woman, and it's because they have these large Hasidic populations. And finally, as far as these groups with extremely high fertility, I did find a map of U.S. Census maps by fertility, and the red areas have total fertility rates of 4 or more. Now, I wasn't able to figure out what's going on with most of these. It's hard to track census tracts because they're too small. It's not like working with counties. But some I was able to recognize, and I have lines from 3 census tracts in the Midwest of the United States to a map showing areas with high percentages of Old Order Amish, and you can see the correlation quite clearly. The largest of these red areas on the map, I put a question mark by because that's quite distinctive. I do know what's going on there. When I asked in the Stanford Continuing Studies class what's going on here, somebody said, well, isn't that the Grand Canyon? And my response was, well, good guess. It includes the Grand Canyon, which is not inhabited, but north of the Grand Canyon is something called the Arizona Strip. You could see it on the map on the right. And it's part of Arizona, but it's cut off from the rest of Arizona. To get there from the county centers, you have to go through Nevada. This geopolitical oddity means that this region has been long characterized by a tremendous amount of sort of autonomy or very little official governmental structure, and it became a sort of a refuge for hyper-fundamentalist Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who wanted to remain faithful to the original church teaching of polygamy, of one man having multiple wives, which was quite characteristic of the faith. It changed in 1890 when the church changed its position and adopted monogamy, which allowed Utah to become admitted to the Union as an American state. But many so-called fundamentalist Mormons who didn't want to make this change fled. Many went to Mexico. Some went into this Arizona Strip area, and so you still have these communities there. It's an odd place. There are only 10 to 15,000 people living there. But it's occasionally in the news, partly for some abuses. Probably most of the young men in the community are expelled when they come of age because there are excess young men when you have these sort of polygynous marriages, one man with many wives. I finally want to note, though, that these high fertility Christian sects are not limited to the United States. There are many Mennonites. The Amish are sort of affiliated with the larger Mennonite group. They all came out of the same Anabaptist movement in the 16th century Reformation in Europe. Most of these Anabaptists fled Europe to avoid conscription. They ended up in the Americas, U.S., Canada, and a lot of Latin American countries. And the map shows some of these movements. So you wouldn't think of many German speakers in Bolivia. I should say these are not people speaking standard German, but rather regional German dialects. But they're certainly growing, and that's showing a population pyramid. You can see that's a pyramid characteristic of stage 2 of the demographic transition theory, where the death rate has gone way down, the birth rate has remained very high, and so you have lots of young people. And that means sort of pressure to find new farmland, and Mennonites have been expanding to a significant degree. And this is showing Bolivia, and I have a couple articles here, one mentioning Bolivia and the other Paraguay. These are both in what is called the Gran Chaco area, which is a lowland zone east of the Andes Mountains, characterized by very flat topography, a very dry season, but a rainy, wet season, poor drainage, poor soils, long been considered just almost impossible to farm. But Mennonites have been quite successful in it, making very profitable farms, and that results in environmental issues and issues with indigenous peoples. So we have, I have two headlines here, one about expansion of Mennonite farmland in Bolivia encroaching on indigenous land, and another on Mennonites turning Paraguay into a mega beef producer and indigenous people sort of paying the price. And environmental issues are large as well. And important to note, though, even in Europe, there are some religious groups they're not as out of the mainstream as Mennonites or Amish, but are nonetheless distinctive. So Europe as a whole has seen a tremendous amount of secularization, and its established churches have moved in a much more liberal direction, if you will. But there are certain sects here and there, generally quite localized, that remain much more fundamentalist in their interpretations. So there's a religious movement in the Nordic countries, particularly in Finland, a pietistic Lutheran revival movement. And people associated with this have much higher birth rates. Not like the Amish. We're not talking about birth rates of 6.5, but birth rates of 3.5 or 4. And so whereas Finland as a whole has a birth rate well under 1.5, in this particular pietistic Lutheran sect located in, focused in a number of towns, it's much higher. And it's not just here. I could show you a map of the Netherlands, for example, where there are some communities that retain the old sort of fundamentalist interpretation of the Dutch Reformed Church, generally in rural areas that have much higher birth rates than the country as a whole. And then finally to note on this topic of religion is that there does seem to be some indication that the highly educated and very religiously devout American women of a variety of different religious groups are increasing their fertility rate. And I bring this up with an article from the Harvard Gazette about a Harvard student, Catherine Pakaluk, who got a PhD from Harvard in 2010. She's a professor of economics at Catholic University and is the mother of 8 and stepmother of 6. And she's recently written this book called Hannah's Children, Women Quietly Defying the Birth Dearth. And she's only looking at educated women who have 5 or more children. And it's quite intriguing to me because as an economist, one would expect her to be looking at this through the lens of an economist with quantitative studies and regression analyses and so on. But instead, she's looking at it in a qualitative sense, looking at questions of purpose, religion, transcendence, and so on, which she thinks is necessary to understand why these women are doing this. And you can see this statistically. I have 2 graphs here just showing a number of women with 4 or more children. The one on the left starting in 1980, and you can see that just plummeting and then slightly increasing. Or the graph on the right, it has the total fertility rate for the U.S. as a whole from 2003 to 2022. And you can see that fertility rate really dropping after 2008 and kind of continuing to slide down. But then the percentage of children, percent of births that are the 5th or higher order, 6th, 7th, 8th, whatever, children per woman has increased. It's not huge by any means, but it definitely can be seen. We can see this in many other ways. There's a graph in Pew Research Center showing among highly educated mom families are getting bigger. Percentage of mothers aged 40 to 44 with a postgraduate degree, with one child, two children, or three or more. And you can see from 1994 to 2014 a big jump in that category of three or more. And if we look at with women in education overall, you could see a very interesting pattern. And I should say, too, we'll see this pretty much the same pattern when we look at income, where the highest fertility is with the lowest level of education. It drops down and sort of bottoms out with a bachelor's degree, and then with master's and doctoral or professional degrees increasing, although not up to replacement level, but from 1.28 to 1.52. That is a significant increase. And part of this just has to do with the cost of having and raising children, something I'll talk about at great length later in this lecture. People with women with doctoral or professional degrees who are very often married to men in the same category are generally going to be quite affluent, and they can afford the extra daycare, nannies, enrichment activities, or whatever is going to go along with having large families. But it is definitely a trend. So the next thing I'm going to look at in this lecture is the growing gender divide in the United States. And again, this is not unique to the U.S. I'll show you one graph anyway that shows it in a number of different countries. But over the last few years, there's been a real distinct political bifurcation, which is associated with differences in religion, with education, and so on, all these things sort of correlating. The graph just shows the percentage of young voters in the United States who supported candidates for the House of Representatives who were in the Democratic Party. And you can see in 2008, men and women, no real difference. By 2022, a pretty significant gap had appeared. And I'll return to this political issue in a second, but first I want to go back to religion just to note something I hinted at, which was that polling is indicating an increase in religiosity, in particular adherence to Christian faiths, from 2022 to 2024. And that's a short period of time, and we really have to wonder if this is really a trend, if enough time has passed. And the numbers are not that big anyway. I mean, it could be within the margin of error. But it's seen in several different studies, and this Pew survey shows that from 2022 to 2024, increase in U.S. adults. What it doesn't show is the gender difference, and all indication is that this is highly gender biased, with young men returning to Christianity much more than young women. Historically, it's been quite the opposite, particularly for Christianity. Back to another Pew table here, but this is showing percentage of each religious group that is either male or female. And in 2007, and pretty much the same in 2014, many more women were Christian than men. Of those professing Christianity, 54% women, 46% men in 2007. The biggest gap being in historically black Protestant denominations, with 60% of those members being female and 40% male in 2007. For non-Christian faiths, it was the opposite obtained, although not to quite the same degree. And I was actually surprised to see this higher rates of men as within professing Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, or Hinduism. Bigger gap, though, was with atheists and agnostics. You can see in 2001 for the self-professed atheist community, 70% male, 30% female, and even agnostic, a big gap. So that has been historically the pattern, but in the last few years, that's really changed. So here we have a survey, Center of American Life. Women outnumber men among young adults leaving religion. So these are people disaffiliated from religion by generation. And you could see for baby boomers, for example, 43% of women disaffiliated from religion versus 57% men. But when you get to Generation Z, the young adults, it has flipped from now 54% of women disaffiliated and 46%. And just a quote from the article, As long as we've conducted polls on religion, men have consistently demonstrated lower levels of religious engagement, but something has changed. A new survey reveals the pattern is now reversed. And I bring this up because I do think it has profound implications for fertility behavior. And I won't go into the reasons, but one of the primary ones is a lot of young women don't think that their religious communities treat women equally. And that's sort of true across the board, but particularly for young women, 2/3 saying that. Or here's another very interesting graph showing birth year and religious attendance, or in the second graph, never attending religion. And you can see for people born in 1984, that was when the crossover occurred. People born earlier, more women attending religious services weekly, and then now quite a few more men, or the same as never attending. It used to be many more men, now it's more women in those age categories, and there's a bit of a difference from the two graphs. So why are American men and women ideologically diverging, if you will, which I think is something that makes marriage and stable pair bonding in general, hence fertility, more difficult to do. So an article from the Brookings Institution looking at this in some detail, finding that Generation Z men, youngest men, are turning away from the feminist label more than older ones. And the article concludes, this is a recent article, by saying that young women are becoming more democratic in their political leanings towards a Democratic Party, whereas young men have stayed relatively the same. I put a question mark after that because most other information I've looked at indicates the opposite. It's indicating that young American men are turning right politically. So here's to the right, to the political right. So here's an graph from Axios, and it's looking at 18 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 29-year-olds in the United States, and whether or not they self-identify as moderate, conservative, or liberal. You can see almost 50% identify as moderate, and that's true in both categories. But notice from liberal and conservative, there's a reversal here, whereas 25 to 29-year-olds, many more identifying as liberal, 27 to 21%, whereas 18 to 24-year-olds, 26% conservative and only 22% liberal. And this has been commented on many times, that Donald Trump's approval rating soars with Generation Z, the youngest adults, but it's really not the generation as a whole, it's the male side of it. And you can see that Trump's approval rating here, and this was from early March, 52.7% approving in that age category. The article headline from The Conversation, I think, is maybe a little more telling, which is "The Lost Boys of Generation Z, How Trump Won the Hearts of Alienated Young Men." So it's particularly young men who are not particularly well educated and have not been able to move into high-paying jobs, in particular, are associated with this movement to the political right. It's not entirely alienated young men, but that's probably the bulk. And there has been this gender-based educational divergence, which seems to correlate with the political divergence. So on the graph on the left, you can see in 1970, adults between 25 and 34 years of age, many more men than women had bachelor's degrees, 22% versus 12%. Now it's quite the opposite story, 46% of women and 36% of men, and that gap seems to be growing larger. And the relatively poorly educated segment of the electorate is the one that has shifted very much in the direction of populist Republican Party, MAGA movement, if you will. So we can see here in the 2024 election poll, there's a clear correlation. High school or less, 62% voting for Trump, and then dropping down to 38% by the time you get to a postgraduate degree. And then voting for Kamala Harris, high school or less, 36%, rising to 59% with postgraduate degree. a few generations ago, it was the opposite tendency. The Democratic Party was a party of the working class, which generally had lower rates of educational attainment, and the professional class tended to be quite Republican voting, even up through the early years of this century. But that has changed, in particular since 2016, with the coming of Trump and his movement on the national stage. This is not an American phenomenon. It's found throughout much of the world, at least the more developed parts of the world. And in fact, it's most extreme in South Korea. That's where the gap is the biggest. And South Korea, among these countries, has by far the lowest birth rate. And I think these are connected. So this graph from Financial Times, it shows sort of movement from 2005 to 2022 or whatever it is, in different countries of men and women movement politically, and the women are red and men are blue, and you could see the above the zero line is increasing affiliation with liberal philosophy, if you will. And I put liberal in quotes because it certainly isn't traditional liberalism. The political left, I think, would be more accurate, versus conservative. And anyway, you could see women moving to the left in South Korea and men really strongly moving. And this, I think, is one reason why there's such a gender gap in South Korea that exacerbates the real sharp decline in the fertility rate. A couple years back, I wrote a little blog post for Geocurrents on fertility in South Korea and why it had declined so much, and tried to make an even-handed article, and I quoted some feminist scholars, and I got quite a bit of hate mail from Korean men excoriating me for daring to quote these feminists who they claimed were responsible for everything that was bad with South Korea. And considering the fact that I don't get many responses to any of these blog posts, that was quite difficult to take. At any rate, you can see in the United States, Germany, even the United Kingdom, they're showing both groups moving to the left politically, but women much more than men. And so this gap, I think, makes it marriage, stable pair bonding, parenting more difficult. And U.S. marriage and stable pair bonding rates have been decreasing, and that's probably linked, at least to some extent, to political and educational divergence, and it's linked, I think, to declining fertility. You don't have to be married or in a stable pair bond to have children, but they're closely correlated, let's put it that way. And so you could just see after 1970, number of newly married people per 1,000, you could just see how that's dropped so sharply, although this is showing it sort of stabilizing it eventually after 2015 or so, but other sources would indicate it is still continuing to go down. In fact, it's very interesting, these two it's essentially one graph divided in two, based again on work by Lyman Stone. It's a Financial Times graphic, but it's trying to tease out of the data and show what's responsible for the change in U.S. fertility rate by factor. And what it would indicate is that from 1960 to 1980, the drop in the fertility rate was mostly due to fewer births among couples. But by the time you get after 2000, it's mostly due to fewer couples, which is the light blue on these graphs. Now, I'm not exactly sure how these sorts of factors are teased out of very complicated data sets, but I'm reasonably sure that they're doing a pretty good job of it. So that does seem to be an important factor. And that's what Lyman Stone has said many times, that there isn't a big decrease in fertility among married couples, but there is this big increase in number of non-married who have much, much lower fertility rates. And this is something that pronatalists often emphasize. So here's a post on X from an account called More Births, obviously pronatalist, but saying the low birth rate crisis can be boiled down to one chart, which can be replicated in most countries around the world. A greater share of young people are staying single, and the graph is indicating that. So this does seem to be an important factor, but it begs the question of, well, why are they staying single? Do they want to stay single? What is happening? So I don't think it can be boiled down to one factor. I think there are many factors going on. And I'm going to now sort of explore some of those other factors. And one, I want to ask whether a mental health crisis among young Americans is contributing to the decrease in marriage, delay in marriage, decrease in fertility, and so on. There's a lot of studies across the board that find the same sort of thing. And this is mostly from self-reporting, but just from this PBS article of 2023, found that in 2021, 57% of high school girls reported experiencing persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness in the past year, up from 36% in 2011. That's twice as high as the 29% of males who reported having those feelings in 2021. So the mental health crisis, if you want to call it that, is found among both young men and young women, but much more severely among young women. There are many reasons that have been put forth for this. A lot of them having to do with technology, smartphones, social media, and so on. I'm not going to go into those arguments now, but it does seem to be clear that there is this big increase in poor mental health and feelings of hopelessness, which make it much more difficult to form stable pair bonds, get married, and certainly have children. Let's look a little bit more about this growing ideological political divide and how it affects U.S. fertility. So not only is there a growing gap between men and women, but the gap between the beliefs of those on the left and right are diverging. There used to be much more overlap, much more amity across the political spectrum. It used to be that the other political party was viewed as the loyal opposition. Now increasingly it's viewed as the enemy, and this is both people on the right and left. I don't think one side is more guilty of this than the other, although I suppose that's debatable. But one thing that is clear is that fertility is increasingly associated with people on the political right, those who vote Republican. So here again, another family studies graph, but it shows total fertility rate by county vote, and you could see the most Republican counties, fertility rate of 1.76. That's still well below the replacement level. And it wasn't that long ago where the whole country had a fertility rate significantly higher than that. So the downward trend has been among Republicans as well as Democrats. But it is a pretty clear correlation here. You can see from the most Republican to middle to Democratic to most Democratic, a downward line in fertility. And in family studies, this research institute, they've graphed this in different ways. These plots are showing different counties, red if Republican, blue if Democratic voting. Against the total fertility rate is graphed against percent Republican vote. And what's interesting is how that line is becoming steeper. You can see in 2012 it wasn't that steep at all, but 2024 significantly steeper, and I think it's probably going to continue to steepen. And again, this is an inversion from previous patterns. In the 1950s, Democrats definitely had the fertility advantage. That's largely because most Roman Catholics were Democrats at that time. They had a much higher birth rate. And that obviously has changed tremendously. And the article from which this graph was taken argues that essentially parties are divided by family. Well, they're divided by many things. I do want to note, though, that demography is not destiny. Are a lot of Democrats who are concerned about this, the Democratic baby bust. What does this mean for Democratic political prospects in the future? But just like religion, people do not stay within the political party to which they are born. They tend to. There's a correlation there. But there's certainly high rates of defection. and particularly from people raised in conservative families who attend left-wing colleges. There's quite a large movement out of that political persuasion. And I think there is an increasing trend for conservatives to not to want to send their children to universities. Well, let me put this differently: to send their children to religiously affiliated colleges. I should have gotten statistics for that. I didn't do it. But anyway, if you look at income, you can see that as with education, fertility drops as income rises, and then it increases just a little. A table derived from ChatGPT, which is not ideal by any means, but we get this from other sources. I've used Grok 3, which is the artificial intelligence associated with Twitter or X. And they're showing something very similar to what we saw with education levels. The average number of children is highest in the lowest income group, 2.3, dropping down. That is a little bit out of date because the numbers overall are too high. Remember, we're down at 1.6 in general for the U.S., so these have to be old figures, but then rising again. It is, though, it's a complicated relationship between income and fertility. Historically, in probably most human societies, the well-to-do have had higher levels of fertility than the poor. Not always. It wasn't true in ancient Rome, but that's been the general tendency, partly because the poor have often been so impoverished it's very difficult for them to raise children. But today we see, well, maybe the best way is to look at this next graph, again from Family Studies, but it's charting children born per woman, household income percentile, and then breaking it down into foreign-born women and native-born non-Hispanic blacks and native-born Hispanic, native-born non-Hispanic whites, native-born non-Hispanic other. And as the caption puts it, the figure is pretty much a chaos of crisscrossing lines. That turns out to be important. There's no cross-culturally stable impact of income on fertility. So there's a correlation, but it's pretty weak. Interestingly, among the most pronatal communities, again, we're talking about the Amish and the Haredi Jews, there seems to be a negative correlation between income and fertility, especially if you look at the red line, the Amish, and you could see total fertility rate up to 8 in the 30th percentile income community, and then dropping down significantly. So that is an interesting way of looking at it. In terms of race, there is now a very small difference in fertility in the U.S. Interesting, Native Hawaiians or other Pacific Islanders, Samoans, Tongans, for example, have the highest. They're the only group with above replacement fertility and just a little above. Hispanic fertility a bit below. General tendency is for immigrants to have higher fertility, especially if they're not highly educated, but then for it to quickly sort of converge on the national mean. You can see not much difference between blacks and whites here. Interesting, American Indians or Native Americans somewhat lower, and Asians lower still. And that lower Asian fertility is going to be associated with urban location, high levels of education, high levels of income, and so on. The difference in fertility rates in the U.S. by race has been decreasing. You can see back in 2000, for example, Hispanic birth rate was considerably higher, close to 3. The black rate, 2.4 or so, and the white rate about 2. And over time, they have come much closer together. And the graph on the right just shows the declines, and you can see it's a much larger decline with Hispanic and also American Indian, and less with white population. And in fact, it looks like in the year 2024 was the year of convergence of white and black birth rates in the United States, where they're now about the same, which had been anticipated for some time. We do have a correlation between population density and fertility. I say it's a negative correlation because the higher the density, the lower the fertility rate. And I've talked about this many times in this class. Again, I couldn't find a good graph. So I had to, or a table, I had to rely on ChatGPT. And I don't know how accurate these data are, but it's showing, urban areas, higher density, lower fertility rates, and higher in rural areas. No surprise. It's what every source comes up with the same one. In fact, back to the family studies, they've tried to come up with some very precise numbers here. So we have area density. So from the least dense to the most dense, it's not a huge change, or even in crowding or number of bedrooms and so on. So I'll talk about these in a bit more detail. Let's just take bedrooms. I mean, is the paucity, the lack of 3-bedroom apartments, is this contributing to the U.S. Fertility decline? And I take this seriously, partly because I've had several people tell me this. Young couples with one child who say, well, we really like to have a second child, but we cannot afford to get a 3-bedroom apartment. We need a 3-bedroom apartment because we need a home office, and each child needs their own bedroom. Now, that also shows a big cultural change, because Americans did not used to think that each child needs their own bedroom. In fact, it's very common to have many children sharing one bedroom. Today, it's especially if for different genders, different sexes, it's generally considered necessary to have separate bedrooms. So we have articles like this Pacific Research Institute, the 3-bedroom solution to our childless cities, lack of large apartments, one of the main reasons, or large apartments and condos, one of the main reasons why big cities have become largely childless. And I should say, as some largest cities of the U.S. now have fertility rates below 1. That's true in many other countries of the world. It is also true that the United States does have ample housing size. I don't know if this map pair is accurate. I'm a bit suspicious, but it's showing average square foot in the United States and Europe. Supposedly it's the same scale, with the United States just having vastly larger dwelling units. I think it's generally true. I don't know if it's true to this extent. So that has often been being bandied about as one of the reasons for very low fertility rates in cities, and pronatalists are pushing for construction of larger apartments, which supposedly would help the birth rate. So we see here again, back to Lyman Stone and family studies. Higher rent, fewer babies, housing costs, and fertility decline. And he notes, at every stage, the housing situation for young people disfavors childbearing more than in the past. Faster rising rents are associated with lower fertility for all age groups. For women in their 20s and 30s, if rent is rising, fertility is falling. Now, we always have to remember, correlation is not causation, and you got to try to tease out these differences. But it is definitely true that housing costs in the United States have outpaced inflation. You could see the orange line is the general inflation line, consumer price index. The bluish, purple line there is U.S. house price index. And you can see a big divergence just in the late 1990s, and then it dropped after the financial crisis of 2008, but then it has re-diverged, and housing has gone up much more. And so this is certainly something that a lot of people talk about, is the cost of housing, difficulty of affording larger units has contributed to this. Globally, though, it does not look like high rent correlates with reduced fertility. And again, I don't know how accurate this graph is. I don't have any reason to doubt it. It has Seoul, South Korea as having quite inexpensive monthly rent. That's on the you can see that that's on the bottom. But it's way down with low fertility and low housing costs, as are Beijing and Shanghai. Interesting to see Paris with very high monthly rent, not the highest, not as high as Manhattan, but still up there, but with one of the highest birth rates, still well below replacement level, but compare that to, you can see Seoul below 0.6. And yeah, this can show you Manhattan well below 1, San Francisco just above. So becomes doubtful. What is a little more certain, though, is that one of the worst situations is for fertility, as far as fertility is concerned, is for young people to remain living with their parents. So here's an article again from a pro-natalist account, More Births, How to Have More Grandchildren. Get your grown children out of the house and then help them out. Help them buy their own house and get them in their own housing, or at least subsidize their rent so that they have their own room to do this. And the article notes one of the worst possible factors for fertility is when adult children remain in the home of their parents. Across hundreds of surveys, the effect of grown children with their parents is overwhelmingly negative for fertility. And if we look at this globally, we could see Italy, young adults aged 25 to 34 living with their parents is 52%, 60% in Greece, 47% in Spain, 52% in Portugal. So these southern European countries have very low fertility levels. No, Poland as well, 48%. Poland has very low fertility as well. A real outlier, I suppose, on that map is Romania, which has one of the higher fertility rates in Europe at 43% of young people living with their parents. Much lower rates, especially in the Nordic countries in Western Europe. And I paired this with an article of Italy's birth rate dropping to a historical low in 2023. And note just how many. Not only living with your parents, I mean, many other things have been associated with lower fertility levels, including something like a seatbelt law in the United States. And here's an article from the Libertarian magazine Reason arguing that, or asking the question of whether seatbelt laws are driving down birth rates. Why would they? Well, because most vehicles can fit only 2 car seats in the back. If you're going to have a third child, then you're going to have to move up to a larger vehicle. If you're going to have 4, you're going to have to be in the minivan category. It didn't used to be that way. When I was young, there were no seatbelt laws. You'd have a station wagon with a large back and 4 or 5 kids rolling around back there. But we're much more safety conscious these days. And we have these laws for good reasons, but it has been argued that they have reduced the birth rate. And as far as safety goes, what some call safetyism, or sort of societal emphasis on creating low-risk environments for children, this has been argued to be one of the reasons for the low fertility rates. So here we have a book, Family Unfriendly, How Our Culture Made Raising Children Much Harder Than It Needs to Be, and then that being related to lower fertility. So the article, the point here is that we have moved into a situation where parents think they need to have extremely high levels of investment in their children if their children are going to succeed. So this means getting them in the best school, sometimes from preschool all the way up through college. This is certainly true in, I should say, in South Korea and Japan, much more than in the United States, but also in enrolling children in many after-school programs and things that require a lot of effort of their parents to manage their schedules, drive them around, and so on. And back in the baby boom in the 1950s and 1960s, it was quite different. Children had much less of this sort of hovering parent attention. And the argument is that the more, as a society, we think we need to have this sort of investment to achieve high rates of success for our children, the less likely we are to have children. I would note that in South Korea, Family Unfriendly has a much more literal meaning because there are many places in South Korea that simply forbid children. And here's a map. It's a widely circulated, crowdsourced Google map just showing the locations of no kid zones. And we can see the little icon there, no dogs, no kids. And also in the photograph, we see a female member of parliament of South Korea protesting this by bringing her own small child to her and sort of protesting this movement of child-free spaces. In the United States, there is an alternative movement getting going, I suppose, that rejects this very high investment strategy for children and also rejects the emphasis or fixation on perfectly safe environments. So this is something that's called the free-range parenting movement, which is a movement that advocates giving lots of unsupervised time for children, let them play, let them go on their own, let them explore their environments. Some people regard this as child neglect. There are occasionally articles of parents being arrested or at least having police visits because their 10-year-old child was out unsupervised, which when I was young was simply the norm. So cultures and societies change, and these have impacts. A few more factors to consider, and this is something I've talked a lot about, but just to give a little more precise information, a question of whether delayed childbearing is reducing fertility. When we can just see the increasing mean age of mother at first birth. That only goes to 2012. If you take it up to 2021, which I did in the table, for women now, it's approaching 30. Well, in 2021 it was 28.6, and men was over 30. And that's a huge increase from what it had been. You can see 1950, mean age of women was 20.3. Now, the issue with this is that if the longer you delay fertility, the more issues you might face with infertility. Again, back to more births as a pronatal site, but posting a curve showing women's fecundity, in other words, ability to conceive and bear children, peaking at around age 20. I thought it was more like 25, but I guess I was wrong, although you can never be sure about these sort of graphs. And that leads then to, with many, many people, particularly those more educated, those more affluent, putting off having children till their mid-30s or even later. A lot of them then cannot conceive. And so we have a huge increase in using reproductive technologies to help people do that. And it's interesting. Well, it's no surprise on this map. You can see percentage of all babies born with assisted reproductive technology being the highest in some of the most affluent, highly educated, democratic voting states. We have Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, D.C., the highest category, New York, Illinois, Virginia also showing up as well. I think the last topic I want to bring up is, and I've mentioned it many times, but just to hit on it again, wondering how much of the recent decline in U.S. fertility is from young people choosing not to have children for environmental reasons. I brought up this tweet by David Hogg. It was mentioned in the recent New Yorker article on the declining birth rate, and it's been widely circulated. David Hogg was an anti-gun activist, was part of a member of a school that was attacked by a school shooter. He has gone on to become the vice chair of the Democratic National Committee. But a few years back, he had a tweet saying, "I'm never planning on having kids. I would rather own a Porsche and have a Portuguese water dog and a golden doodle. Long term, it's cheaper and better for the environment, and will never tell you that it hates you or asks you to pay college." It's kind of a snide comment that hasn't been much criticized in certain circles. But the point I want to make is it definitely does seem to be that many young Americans are not having children, partly for environmental reasons. That's certainly often the stated reason. And there are a lot of articles on this that, here's one from Think saying science proved kids are bad for the earth. What they simply mean is more people, the more carbon dioxide emissions. Morality suggests we stop having them, or thinking about having a baby even during the climate crisis. Should we be having kids in the age of climate change, and so on. Now, if you look at the number of people who say this is why they're doing it, it's pretty low. A Pew Research survey said only about 5% of childless adults cited climate change or the environment as their reason. But as we actually go and look at that Pew poll, we find it's a little bit different. Yeah, 5% say that's the primary reason, but 9% say state of the world, and climate change, the environment, is certainly part and parcel of state of the world. So all these things overlap, and it's really hard to indicate one single reason. It's usually multiple reasons for these sorts of things. Second to last slide here. It does seem to be, though, that the overall decreasing desire for children is one of the largest reasons for the fertility decline. And we can't really say why this decreasing desire for children is occurring. There are many, many reasons for it, and it correlates with a lot of factors. But it is interesting that in this Pew Research survey, found that the most important thing in life is not having children, but having other enjoyable job, close friends, and so on. And many as 42% saying having children is not at all important in having a fulfilling life. And I think that's really also associated with increasingly secular viewpoints. For the religious people, it's much more important in general. And finally, just to summarize some of this, and it's impossible really to do so, but in the United States, if we look at higher fertility communities and lower fertility communities, we find that there are a lot of correlating factors, and they're all closely associated with each other. But for the higher fertility communities, more Republican voting or conservative, more religious, living in more rural or exurban areas or the outer suburbs, less educated, but I note also some of the most highly educated a little bit also in that category, but mostly it's less educated. Lower parental investment or obsession, if you want to look at it that way. Much less of a concern for perfectly safe environments and less delay in childbearing. And then for the lower fertility communities, more democratic voting, more secular, large cities, inner suburbs, more highly educated, more parental involvement, safetyism, longer delays in childbearing. And then one thing that's really changed in its correlation is racial categories, with blacks and whites in the middle here, Asians in lower fertility communities, Hispanic a little bit higher, but I put arrows to note that there's sort of convergence going on, and that's racial categories are less important as time goes by. So that's it for today's lecture. I will conclude with one more. It'll be a shorter lecture, but it will look at more at global patterns, and it will look at areas of the world with continuing high fertility, particularly tropical or sub-Saharan Africa, and areas that have seen rapid drops quite recently. And East Asia has very low fertility, but that's been true for some time. Latin America really has seen the largest declines just over the last few years. And I'll take two countries that focus in on a little more detail from each category. One would be Nigeria in Africa, and the other would be Chile in Latin America. And there are reasons to be concerned about both of these countries. With Nigeria, concerned for continuing high fertility. It's dropped, but it's still quite high. And with Chile, with just a sort of a spectacular decline, it's practically down to South Korean levels, and that's happened very recently, and it's interesting to try to figure out why that would have happened. So thank you for listening, and I hope you can listen to the final lecture.